Hey guys, what's up? So, Chief Clown of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, gave his big yearly speech at the Jackson Hole, Wyoming event this week. And all the people in the financial press have been trying to read the tea leaves of that speech and parse out what they think is going to happen with interest rates based on it. And kind of the consensus that's developing is they think that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates a half point in September, a quarter point in November, and a final quarter point in December. And of course, the reason they would cut is there have been some bad jobs data these last couple of reports. A big survey of jobs data that was for, I believe, April of 23 through March of 24. They came back with a big revision of that, down 800,000 jobs, which was something like 30% of the total, which you get better data over time and they revise the numbers. They always do that, but it was a huge revision in the wrong direction. And so everyone widely expected the Federal Reserve would finally cut interest rates. The reason this is bad is that real estate is still in a monstrous bubble, an absolutely giant bubble. And cutting interest rates will make it worse because it will make loans for real estate even cheaper. And when you do that, people will pay more money for real estate. All of this kind of goes back to, about the mid 2000s is when the whole roller coaster started. You had a lot of real estate speculation. You just had this kind of wild idea that real estate could appreciate forever. Prices were going up and up and up. And then eventually you had the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and real estate dropped a bit. And more importantly, interest rates got pushed down. So interest rates got set to zero to help stimulate a recovery from that. And they basically stayed nearly zero for close to 10 years. It wasn't until about 2019 that the Fed started to try to cautiously start increasing interest rates. Then we hit 2020, the world went to hell, and they lowered the rates back to almost zero. After that, they started raising them in earnest because the economy was way, way too hot and inflation was too high. And of course, one way to tackle inflation is to raise the interest rate. Now, in that time period of the 2010s, when interest rates were very, very low, we saw this great corporatization of real estate in the US and in a lot of places around the world, where investment companies would borrow money at zero or near zero, and they would use that money to buy real estate. And they'd buy all kinds of real estate. It wasn't just houses, it was commercial properties, industrial properties, storage, warehouses, everything. And that created a lot of perverse incentives in the market that created a lot of sickness that has not worked out in the scant 3 years that we've had historically normal interest rates. And we've become so messed up in the head over interest rates in these last, say, 17 years, where we think interest rates should be 0 or 1%. And the problem with that is nothing allocates well at a cost of zero, including money. Interest rates are the price you pay for money. And anything that's sold at zero will not allocate in a healthy way. People will have different incentives, they won't make the right choices, and it ends up with things you've seen in the market these last couple of years where homes are more and more expensive. If you look back at the median home price going all the way to the bottom of 2009 and you look out to today, it's gone from $208,000 to $412,000 in the US. And if you do the math on that, you do a real quick, rule of 72 because it just about doubled. And that was 15 years. And what you get is about 4.8% per year compound growth rate. And at first, that doesn't sound bad, but that's only in dollars. If you compare it to wages, it's gotten a lot worse. Homes have become much more expensive compared to wages over the last 15 years. So you've had a similar issue with office space since the pandemic because so many more people are working at home now. Office space has become a lot less valuable, but it's not really transacting at those lower values, and especially commercial space. And I have some anecdotes from that. Before that, there's a couple people on YouTube that I see from time to time. There's Louis Rossman, Cash Jordan. Both of those guys talk about New York City real estate a lot and the huge problems where they just walk down the street and dozens upon dozens of commercial spaces are empty for lease and they're not being leased. And the issue goes to the fact that these companies bought these places during the 2010s with free money. They took out loans that had 1% interest rates. And they bought these places hoping to rent them out. They thought these would be good investments. And what happens is there's not as much demand for those kind of places now. But they can't simply lower the lease rate. They can't lower that monthly rent. Because if they do, then they have to write down the value of the property. They have to admit that the property is worth less than they paid for it. When they do that, then their loan to value covenants in their loans will trigger and they'll have to pay off the loans. And which means they'll have to sell the property at distressed prices. And they can't do that or they basically go broke. So they're going broke the slow way by holding all this real estate that nobody is leasing from them instead of going broke the fast way by admitting that the real estate has lost huge amounts of value and it needs to be repriced and rents and leases need to come down in order to get new tenants into the properties. So I mentioned Louis Rossman and Cash Jordan do that in New York City. There's a guy out in California. His channel was called A German in Venice, and he's been doing it for years. He covers other issues in California. There's no shortage of those. Even Graham Stephan, who normally he's just kind of like a YouTube finance huckster kind of guy, but he made some videos just recently about going back to where he grew up and lived for a long time in California and seeing the same exact thing, that all these commercial properties are empty. And again, it's the same reason. The companies cannot admit that the lease rates need to come down in order to get new tenants in there, because that would end up admitting the value of the property has sunk, and then that would get their loans called in by their creditors. So I have my own anecdotes on this. I live in the DFW Metroplex, which kind of comically between those guys in New York City and the other guys in California, DFW is in the center of the country. And DFW Metroplex is the fourth largest Metroplex by population, and it's very fast growing. Economically, it's doing very good. And specifically, I live in Arlington, which is in the very center of the Metroplex. Arlington, I believe it's still the 50th largest city in the US. It's something like 450,000 people population. And when I go walking around in downtown Arlington, it looks like those videos of New York City or California. There are empty commercial spaces everywhere. There are entire blocks that are empty. When we have the Christmas parade in downtown Arlington, they make all of the property owners turn on the lights and put some kind of decoration in the windows so that as the parade goes by and people are out on the streets, they don't notice how many of the properties are empty unless they're really paying attention. And so it's the same exact deal. All of these companies came in, they borrowed money way too cheap. The money should have never been that cheap to start with, and they used it to buy all these properties, and now they can't admit that they need to lower the lease rates to get people in there. And it's this huge amount of sickness that's pent up in the real estate market, and specifically the commercial real estate market. And having real, historically normal interest rates of closer to 5% for about the last 3 years has been nowhere near long enough to shake out all of that sickness. It's going to take a lot longer. And part of the reason it couldn't shake out all of it in only that time is companies were able to lock in debt on very long-term issues. So if you could lock in debt for a 10-year note at 1% interest, you could have ridden out this brief 3-year period where we once again had historically normal interest rates. And then now that the Federal Reserve sees, hey, these employment issues are becoming finally too large, and the economy's getting a bit more sluggish and it's slowing more. Now they have to do something about it. And the Federal Reserve, I mean, it's they're fucking clowns anyway. To think that, to have the hubris to think we can set the price of money and get that right, but they think they do, and they have that power. And so they mess with the prime rate, and they're going to lower it in order to help the economy. Now, will it help unemployment? Yeah, it should. Will it help the stock market? If increasing the price of stocks is helping the stock market, then yes, it will. Will it help the real estate market? Well, it will assist in price discovery because, especially in residential real estate these last couple of years, you've had price discovery somewhat inhibited because at the end of 2020, people could get a 3% mortgage, and today it's 7%. So a lot of people have been priced out of moving. They've been priced out of either buying a first home or selling their home that they refied into a 3% mortgage in 2020 and getting into a different home that would now be a 7% mortgage that they can't afford. So that's impaired price discovery the last few years to some extent. So yeah, lowering the interest rate, getting mortgage rates to come down a little bit, they'll have to pass down through 6 and 5 and 4. They'll find a new floor. But to a great extent, the residential real estate market has its own kind of sickness where the price of houses has outpaced the increases in wages over the last 17 years. And because of that, houses are too expensive, and they need more time at higher interest rates for the market to adjust for these companies that have bought up hundreds of thousands of houses in the country over the last 15 years to get to some distress in their loans that they owe, and then have to start selling, and for the market to start coming down. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to lower the interest rate to juice the stock market, to help the unemployment numbers, and we're going to stay in this kind of very, very, very sick real estate market with all this pent-up sickness that we have in the U.S. And it's unfortunate because, I go walking around downtown Arlington, and there are a lot of spaces I'd love to put a card store, but they're out of my reach right now. Final Trade can't afford it at this time. And if we could get any type of semblance of real price discovery, real interest rates for the long term in the commercial real estate market, then we would see leases have to come down. The rents for all those spaces that have been empty in downtown Arlington would have to come down. And, I've got spots I've talked about before where, near to my house in Arlington, and there are specific slots in commercial strip centers where the slot has been vacant for 9 years. 9 years I've driven by it and it's been vacant constantly. You can go back on Google Earth and you can look at them, and they've been vacant for 9 years. And there's plenty more that have been vacant for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. When you go back on Google Earth, when you just remember driving by them, for as long as I've lived here, some of those spots have been vacant. But when money is free and a giant company can rent, they can borrow money at near zero interest rate, they can get it on long terms, and then they can simply hold the commercial spots with no tenant in there paying for them because the cost is almost nothing. And they can just try to wait out until the market comes up to it. And the problem is the market isn't coming up to it. More and more and more of those commercial spaces are empty. And, there's one particular spot in downtown Arlington that I really like. I think it would just be perfect. It's really close to the university, and it's just a perfect building and everything. And I took my dad by it a while back to show him. And it was funny because I hadn't driven by it in a while. And the business that was next door to it had gone out of business in the time since I had previously been down that street. And so, it was empty now also. And who knows how many months it had been empty since the last time I had come by and seen that place. But it's just that story downtown again and again and again. There's too much commercial real estate. The lease rates are too high. And the companies that own them are still too high on money that is artificially cheap. We need higher interest rates for longer. We need 5-6% for longer, but that would start wrecking employment, that would start wrecking the stock market. You know, the real issue is that we've gotten such a sick economy with too much of these idiots at the Federal Reserve thinking that they're smart enough to know the proper price of money. And we've had that for too long in the US, and there's so much sickness in various parts of the market, different kinds of sickness in different places, and it needs time to shake out. And real estate's not going to get the time to do that. Real estate and the real estate bubble, which has only barely to the smallest degree started to deflate in these last 3 years of historically normal interest rates, is just going to start building up again. And it's unfortunate because, I get a little sad every time I drive by an empty commercial spot, because it's like there should be a business in there creating value and employing people and doing stuff and then paying taxes and making money and all the things that businesses do, and instead you see all these spots that have been empty for 9-10 years because money was artificially cheap, and we're going to keep it that way. So I don't see a solution to this. Ideally, you would not have a Federal Reserve with a bunch of clowns who think they know what the price of money should be. That'd be the first ideal solution. The second ideal solution is that somehow, and it's not possible because money is fungible, but somehow you could set separate interest rates for real estate, and money for real estate and money for other things. I mean, I know there's different risks involved, but the base rate upon which that risk premium is then added needs to be different, but there's no real way to do that. So our giant real estate bubble is just going to start expanding again once Jerome Powell lowers the rate, probably in September. It's unfortunate, but here we are. Let me know what you think, guys. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.